Ok. ah, Buenos días a todos. Estamos comenzando nuestras actividades del Día Mundial de la Lógica. En breve comenzaremos con la mesa redonda. Ya estamos aprestándonos con todo para que sea una muy buena transmisión. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. En unos minutos comenzamos. María, estamos transmitiendo ya en vivo. Te voy a dar las condiciones para que puedas abrir y demás, pero es importante que te diga que estás en vivo. Ok. Ser anfitrión. Listo. Ok. Puedes abrir tu...
Hi.
Perfecto.
Yeah.
Hi, Maria.
How are you, Lorenzo? Nice to meet you. We have
Yes,
never met each other.
it is my pleasure. Okay. Thank you. I'm okay. And you? Yeah?
Oh, we are fine. We are fine. I am in the
You,
south part of Mexico, so it's warm here. But Gabriel is in the center in Mexico
okay.
City. So
Okay. So you are not in Mexico City?
no, 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 not yet. It's
Not
too
yet.
cold for me. Yeah, but same in Italy, right? Very cold. Not
In,
yet.
in this moment, I am in Liguria, in the Mediterranean
I
Sea.
see.
So it is a bit warmer. Yeah,
Better.
okay.
Yeah.
So let me check the temperature. So here is, wait a moment.
Ok, creo que hay problemas de conectividad.
Ah, sí, justo eso me iba a preguntar si era
Yes, there
yo.
was a problem, of course.
No, I think... ah, ok.
Yep,
Yes, Maria. I was saying that here it is 14 centigrade.
I see.
Yeah,
Better,
okay.
but
So
it's still not warm, right?
no, it is not cold. Yeah, 14.
Yeah.
Em,
Uh,
¿Quieres abrir la sala ya, María? Hay bastantes, pero no
Sí,
están todavía las
hay
personas
que dejarlos entrar y luego volvemos a todos co-host, los participantes.
en su
Después,
momento, porque
después
supongo
les
que lo que
quitamos.
me preocupa es que esté alguien de nuestros participantes de la mesa y no le podamos identificar por su handle, por su usuario. ¿Me explico?
No, 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 pero ahora no es el caso.
Ok,
Pero
entonces
hay que
arrancamos.
dejarlos entrar, sí.
Bueno, bueno, aquí va el riesgo. Ay, Dios mío. Mira, ahí hay un Otavio bueno, espero que sea el de verdad. Le voy a dar los privilegios. Listo.
So, hello everybody. We are going to wait for another 5 minutes
Otavio.
for a couple of panelists that are missing still, but we are going to let you know that you cannot open your camera or your mic until the Q&A time. So unless you are one of the panelists, you are not going to be able to use the microphone until after 1 hour of the roundtable. So if you have any questions, any concerns, just raise them in the chat and we will pay attention to that. Yes, let's wait for 5 more minutes.
Okay.
There's
Hi, Otavio.
There is
BRYSON.
Hey, Lorenzo, how are you? Good to see you.
Yes, it's very good. My pleasure.
Yes.
Are you in Miami?
Yes, I'm in Miami
Okay.
now. How about you? Where in the world are you now?
No, in this moment I am in Sestri Levante,
Okay.
in Liguria. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know the
And
place.
yes, I know it's beautiful. It's a gorgeous place. Yeah.
So
So
I'm not in a cold area of Italy.
that's
It is
good.
warmer here than in Milan, in
Right.
Pavia. Okay.
Yeah. Well, today's code by Miami standards.
Oh,
So
really?
yeah. Well, the US is going through a very cold front. And
Yeah.
so when it's freezing in the north, it gets fresh and nice here down here.
Okay.
And how about you, Maria? How are you?
No, I'm fine. I'm in Oaxaca, so I'm avoiding the cold weather for another week or so. But
Good. Yeah.
Bryson,
Yes, hello.
hi, how are you doing?
Not too badly. Every time I seem to enter a new meeting like this, the rules and clicks are different. So I had a little trouble there.
No, don't. If you have any question, just let us know. You are now one of the co-hosts because of the security reasons. We are not allowing people to use their microphone or their camera unless they are co-host. So that is the reason why you all are allowed to give people like open doors to the room now. But
I see.
so don't kick anybody out, please.
Okay, unless I don't like them, right?
Not yet, at least.
Let me just see.
So okay. So I'll be right back.
Okay.
Ok, la transmisión es estable. Ya tenemos bastante gente también sintonizando en el canal y pues aquí en la sala de Zoom, entonces todo va perfecto.
Hmm.
Mm.
I do have a camera here, but it's not coming through.
I think what you can do is leave the room and come back, and we make sure before you actually enter that we allow you to do that.
I see.
Um,
I hesitate because the link was a little bit awkward to get through. Although, yeah,
I
I
see.
don't mind giving it a try if you like.
Well, however you feel comfortable, Bryson.
I'm prepared to talk, I guess, and we're certainly hearing each other, so that's a pretty good start.
Anyway, I am not sure that would work out, Maria. I think it's a risk. I think Bryson is right. It might be.
So Bryson, just stay as you are
Just
then.
stay. There's
I'll do it that way.
ATOCHA there.
Okay.
Now ATOCHA should be able to open both her microphone and her camera. There she is. Perfect. Okay. We are. I think we're good to go, Maria, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Let me close my things. Good. Thank you, everybody, for being here. As I was mentioning moments ago, you, the people that are in the room that know our panelists, you are not going to be able to open your microphone nor your camera until the Q&A part of the session. So that means 1 hour or something like that, you are going to not be able to talk. But if you have any questions or any problems, just send a message in the chat, and we'll pay attention to that. We have also people in YouTube trying to make some questions. If you also have any concerns or any questions that want to be raised, just type them in the comment section of the broadcast on YouTube, and we'll try to raise them when the moment comes. So it is great to have you all here. I am very, very happy about having the speakers that we have. As I mentioned in a Spanish broadcast that Gabriel and I had 2 days ago about this roundtable, I am a fan of the work of all of you, and I believe the audience is also a fan of the work of all of you. And also, LogicaMX has had a long history of trying to connect philosophy of science and logic and certain aspects of science. And so it is a pleasure to host this roundtable on the applicability of logic for the study of scientific reasoning. And so I am going to go very fast through the names of you all, and then we get to the real thing, which are the questions. But I'm very happy to have, as a Mexican and in many senses raised by her, I'm very happy to have ATOCHA Aliseda here. ATOCHA is very much famous for her work in on abduction and scientific reasoning, but also now she's working on abduction and inferential reasoning in medicine. And so it is a pleasure to have ATOCHA as a colleague from UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. But also it is a pleasure to have Otavio Bueno, who is more famous on his work on both philosophy of mathematics and philosophy of logic and also philosophy of science. Otavio has worked largely on analyzing different types of reasoning that take place when we have something like inconsistent information, partial information, and so on and so forth. So it is a great pleasure to have you here. Bryson Brown is very much well known for his work on paraconsistent reasoning strategies such as chunk and permeate, his work on preservation of reliability in scientific context, but also some philosophy of science related to the use of inconsistent information. In this sense, maybe his more recent work is touching connections with climate sciences and how different models use mutually inconsistent commitments or assessments of the phenomenon in order to have good results. And finally, but not less important, we have Lorenzo. Lorenzo Magnani is coming from University of Pavia, but from a better from a better weather than the one in Pavia maybe right now. And Lorenzo is very much recognized for his work also on abduction, but more recently his work on cognitive sciences in order to illuminate some parts of whatever the reasoning is in scientific context. So also touching topics such as creativity, heuristics, and so on and so forth. We are very, very happy to have you all here and finally to discuss topics that are of interest to both philosophers of science and logicians and people in general interested in either science or logic and the connection between them. So, as I mentioned, the work of you all is very much in touch with the ideas of reasoning in science and using formal tools or informal tools to model or describe or explain whatever is happening in those contexts. And I wanted to ask the first question to all of you, which is, how do you see the role of logic in the study of scientific reasoning today? Has this role evolved in recent decades? Do you see any progress? Do you see any more mistakes being committed? Please, maybe we start with last name. So ATOCHA, do you want to go first?
Thank you, Maria. Sure. Okay, so yeah, this is a difficult question, if only because we would have to agree or at least share our vision of what logic is and even more of what scientific reasoning is. So what I would like to say first is that these terms have actually not so much changed, but themselves, but the perceptions we have on them in a way, because my own vision of logic, and this is displayed in a book I have in Spanish, which is titled Logic as a Tool for Reasoning. Well, let's think of logic as a tool. So we really have to start first discussing of what scientific reasoning is. And what I displayed here is, well, to some extent, but I think this is mistaken, the perception is that deductive logic or deductive reasoning in the framework of classical reasoning is what we had with the positivists. However, from there, and they wanted to use this framework to model scientific reasoning. However, that is not so exact, because from the very start, it was clear that deductive reasoning was not the reasoning for empirical sciences. It was rather inductive logic. Remember that Carnap himself devoted part of his life to the study of or the search for an inductive logic to model scientific reasoning. So it's not deductive. Scientific reasoning is inductive from the positivist view. But then, although it was acknowledged by some of the positivists and post-positivists that the process of induction was crucial, or it is crucial for science, for scientific reason, although it was not perceived or labeled as abduction, abductive reasoning as the search for hypotheses has always been central.
Oh, I think we lost ATOCHA.
Yes, I think we lost ATOCHA.
We lost ATOCHA.
Maybe, well, this is the cost of having something live via Zoom. Maybe we move to OTAVIO. Meanwhile, we have ATOCHA back.
Yeah. So I actually have a slightly different take than she does. So it's too bad that she's not here to listen, and because I do think that first, it's very difficult to determine what the underlying logic is of any piece of scientific reasoning, in large part because it's done informally, right? And and as such, when you formalize, there are many routes and many different ways you can formalize the same piece of reasoning according to different logics. So it's hard. Any finite piece of reasoning can be made compatible with a variety of different logics that would differ elsewhere, but agree with that particular piece. So I find it hard just this, okay, this is the underlying logic, right? But by and large, I think it's possible to make sense of these pieces of reasoning primarily in purely deductivist ways. I don't think we need inductive logic, right? And in fact, I would be a little worried because inductive logic is generally invalid. And you don't want to lose information that it's very costly, right? Get from true premises to false conclusions, right? So now, having said that, if you have that in mind, an important role that logic has had, for example, since Frege, when he sort of set up what we now call mathematical logic, was primarily a normative role, right? To make sure that the validity of pieces of reasoning will go through, right? And the issue is the kinds of reasonings that we can check that way are very local, very small and punctual, right? So what happened was then we were able to do that for specific little portions, right? Frege did that in quite interesting ways for arithmetic, right? So that's a very narrow portion, right, of reasoning. And then something quite interesting happened. Whenever you formalize something, you lay out the rules, you allow for people to ask questions. Why don't we change this part, right? Why do we have to accept this bit, right? And that's exactly how the very idea of non-classical logics then emerged. When people realize, look, it's unclear that these particular kinds of reasoning here are generally valid, right? So we found that with worries about explosion, worries about excluded middle, right? And then non-classical logics start to emerge. And the way I like to think about it, and that address the issue of the limitations of logic, I think every logic has its own limitations. It laid out what it aimed to do. So Frege designed classical logic primarily to deal with a topic that deals with mathematical objects, that deal with objects that are largely immutable, right? Very stable. There's no vagueness, no indeterminacy, no inconsistency as much as you can tell, right? So it's very extremely idealized. And once you try to address slightly less idealized contexts, where you allow for inconsistencies or allow for indeterminacies, vagueness, then certain possibilities emerge, right? Where you can then make sense of reasonings in contexts where, there are inconsistency, or there are vague objects, or there are objects that are indeterminate, referentially indeterminate, their properties. And in that way, in specific contexts, some of those classically valid logical principles have been constrained. So those are some of the limitations, right? Now, even non-classical logics have their own limitations, right? So of course, if you're interested in studying inconsistencies, paraconsistent logics are very good, right? They allow to study properties of inconsistent objects without triviality. But what if you want to study trivial things, right? Then you cannot do even with paraconsistent logic, right? So it has limitations built in, given what the logic aims to do, right? Or if you want to do study properties of constructive objects, right? You can't do that with classical logic. You do it with an intuitionistic one. But you cannot study with an intuitionistic logic inconsistent things, right? So their limitations are built in, and that we need to understand. But instead of thinking that as a constraint, think of this as a possibility, because then you can highlight areas in which you can expand what's possible by revising some of those logical principles. And I think that's what some of the things have happened, right, throughout the 20th century, but primarily with the development of non-classical logics.
Perfect, Otavio. We have ATOCHA already in the room, but she still cannot use her mic because Gabriel has to allow her. So meanwhile, let's move to BRYSON. BRYSON, you are muted, but I can.
We cannot see.
We cannot see BRYSON, but we are going to be able to hear
only
BRYSON.
the name.
All right.
Yeah.
Sorry to be hiding, but I didn't make that choice myself. So about the opening questions, I've got sort of some sketched out responses to each of them. So I'll just go through those, hopefully without eating up too much time. The first question about the role of logic in the study of scientific reasoning. I believe that formal logic, at least in its traditional form, has some pretty serious limitations. It got started with a broad foundation for systematizing formal theories, modeling them as sets of sentences closed under some consequence relation, which is great. But I think if we try to deal with that using formal predicate logic, where the letters are really ghosts of predicates, they're placeholders for predicates, not actual predicates. The kinds of predicates we actually use, on the other hand, in describing the world, come with connections, come with inference. And that's true in colors. One color can be just absolutely inconsistent with another color, red versus green, for instance. If it's red through and through, you don't get any green. There's not a sort of simple standard logical way to create that except by perhaps just adding a not. You just don't get to do that, expressing that you just don't get to do that. But in the formal logics, the predicates really are just there as stand-ins. Descriptive properties, of course, in natural languages and in scientific languages, they come in with what Sellers called language entry rules. And they come with language rules where we make inferences within the language, and they come with language exit rules that lead to, say, responses to situations. Yeah, where am I at in this? I think our responses to situations where we say or we think such things emerge in language exit moves, including what do? We make actions, so on the one hand, we're reasoning, and on the other hand, we're responding actually in the world in an active way. So I think this combination that you find in Sellers' work of language entry and material reasoning, as well as leaving the language and getting to some kind of action or response to your circumstances, I think those work together pretty well as a way of thinking about the importance of and the role of science and scientific theories and the role of logic in basically working with those kinds of input and arriving at new conclusions. So I think the logic is useful in the background. We find some conclusions in a language that's actually applied and used to describe the world. And we get, once we add, of course, in the standard logics, accounts of the relations between these predicates that we express in the form of what are called natural laws of nature, then we have a pretty nice picture of what's going on in the application, in the use of a particular scientific theory. I hope that came through fairly clearly. It's half reading.
Perfect, Bryson. No. We are going to press you a bit more on those issues in a couple of questions later, so be ready. Sure. And then, ATOCHA, we have you back, so if you want to finish your response, Otavio had already opposed himself to what you were saying, but if you want to finish now, you can do it, and then we move to Lorenzo.
Well, sorry for the technical problem, but anyway, yeah, the only thing I would like to add, not to take too much time, is again, I think they had different names, labels, but the issue that scientific reasoning is not deductive, but rather inductive and abductive, was present since the time of Aristotle, I would say. Even Wesley Salmon, the only thing I want to mention now, Wesley Salmon has a beautiful book called Logic, and precisely here he talks about inductive arguments. He cannot call them valid, of course, but rather he uses correct what when an inductive argument or an inductive inference is correct. He doesn't label non-monotonic logics at all, but he's aware that induction and what we call now abduction are inferences that may be fallible. So basically, that's all. And the very final comment on limitations of logic. In my opinion, logicians, perhaps compared to other researchers, have been always aware and interested in finding the limitations of logic itself. Of course, logic is not enough, and it will never be enough to analyze something such as scientific inference. So maybe logic is useful, as I said, as a tool for abstraction and for very particular aspects, or rather processes in scientific reasoning. I think that's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thanks, ATOCHA. Now, Lorenzo, do you want to say something? Do you want to say that everybody else is wrong?
Yes, yes. So the colleague is already covered a lot of aspects. I can add a simple observation. You know that you cannot see science only as a kind of static object, because everyone knows that after Popper, we have to see science and scientific reasoning as a kind of a dynamic object. So I think that every aspect of the recent developments of logic that were interested in pluralistic concentrated logics and also dialogic aspects, of course, non-monotonic reasoning, and also model-based aspects. There is a small field that is called the field of heterogeneous logic, in which not only you can use symbols, but also small diagrams and so on. So I think that all these aspects are related to improve the knowledge, the logical knowledge of scientific reasoning, even not necessarily directly, okay? But you can exploit logical aspects to increase your knowledge about scientific reasoning, even if not necessarily there is, so to say, a logic of scientific discovery, okay? But you can improve your knowledge thanks to the recent development of logic, much more than in the past, of course, especially and not only thanks to the non-standard logics.
Perfect. That connects very neatly with the following question. So before I asked it, we are going to start with Otavio, then Bryson, then Lorenzo, and finally ATOCHA. And so you had already mentioned about some of the limitations that we can find in scientific reasoning to privilege certain logics, but I was wondering whether you have any example in mind of where a specific logical framework has significantly advanced our understanding of a particular type or a particular case of scientific reasoning, and also connecting it with the last comment of Lorenzo and to some things that Otavio had already mentioned. what do you think of the role of classical logic when analyzing scientific reasoning? Do you think it is still enough? It can help us to model, explain, describe certain types of scientific reasoning, or it is not useful anymore? So, Otavio, please.
Okay, yes, those are great questions. And I think in terms of an example, I think there are several cases. As I said, usually throughout sciences, to the extent that there is an underlying logic, it tends to be classical, because classical logic has all kinds of advantage and nice features, right? So if you can use classical logic, we do. But exactly because of the nice features that classical logic has, it also has its own limitations, right? I mentioned the way, if you're interested in study properties of inconsistent objects, it's very hard. Well, you can't, right? In classical logic, because they lead to triviality, right? Or if you want to study properties of constructive objects in mathematics, again, classical logic doesn't allow. So those are examples, right? So for example, the whole field of constructive mathematics or inconsistent mathematics, it's just not possible at all with classical logic, right? So these are possibilities that are foreclosed by the logic alone, right? But also, and of course, there are interesting new results, interesting new theorems, especially in constructive mathematics, right? Where you can get different proofs, and often more informative proofs by constructive means. But this is not just so that I'm not saying that only non-classical logics have something to say, right? So I think even in classical logics, there are some formal frameworks that have been very interesting and illuminating, right? Non-standard analysis, I think it's a good example. This is done purely classically, right? But you need a formal framework, right? When Robinson devised it, he initially constructed it in type theory. It's a very awkward, very convoluted framework, right? Eventually, Luxemburg and others moved that to set theory, and then it's a more congenial place where mathematicians feel more at home to do the work and explore the properties of the various models, right? So this is sort of an example where more logical tools, right? This is basically application of model theory back to mathematics, where you can obtain new results by thinking about some of the formal properties. So I don't think that's restricted, right? The possibilities that I have in mind are restricted just to non-classical logics, right? But there are many cases in which they are indispensable, right? Those that I mentioned. Let me just say another one, right? In that case, it's a matter of illuminating issues about the foundations of quantum mechanics, not quantum mechanics per se, but the basis of it, right? And that comes also with frameworks that allow us to explore possibilities having to do with quantum objects not having well-defined identity conditions. Again, classical logic doesn't allow that, right? But with non-reflexive logics, Schrödinger logics that, also, Stephen French, Décio Krauss have developed in detail. This is something that can be done. So those are examples, right, of possibilities that can be explored on the basis of revising the logical framework, right? Now, a lot of results in science can be done, the standard ones can be done basically with classical logic, but not all of them. And I think that's important, right? There are things that cannot be said, cannot be inferred, cannot be studied just with classical logic. And I think that's something that we learn throughout the 20th century and the 21st.
So, thank you, Otavio. Bryson, do you want to comment on this question?
Unmute myself here. Yeah, I think there's a nice sort of pragmatic perspective that I've just heard from Otavio, because we're talking about whether or not and where we're going to apply classical logic. It's quite convenient. It's pretty clear. and it works quite well in a lot of circumstances. So it's a nice pragmatic stance there, and at the same time, the recognition that sometimes you're in a place where the ways you're going to reason are not going to be that way, because, well, among other things, you get explosion. And so I think that's perfectly reasonable approach to this. We want to use these tools when we need them, and if we don't need them, formal logic is often just fine.
Well, thank you very much, Bryson. And now, Lorenzo, do you think still classical logic can help us with analyzing scientific reasoning? Not?
Okay, so classical logic is always the king of logic, but in my case, the specific logical framework that was useful in my research, in the organization of events and of research itself, was classical logic, because given the fact that in my case, the aspect of scientific reasoning that is the most important is hypothetical reasoning, that is abduction, okay? It is useful and very useful, I have to say, to have seen and to have studied all the frameworks that were invented, created to describe hypothetical reasoning. Not necessarily hypothetical creative reasoning, such as in the case of scientific discovery, but in diagnostic reasoning, in dialogic reasoning, in dynamic aspects. And so this is important because, of course, it was necessary to exploit non-classical frameworks. But thanks to the frameworks, it was also, I want to underline this aspect. Using logic, you can see things, you can imagine things, imagine concept, imagine idea in other fields of research. For instance, epistemology, for instance, computational science or cognitive science, that you are not able to see without the help of logic. And you can detect aspects that are important and that logics with its limitation is not able to grasp, but that you are able to grasp thanks to this intertwining with logical research. This is my idea. And of course, in my case, the specific case is the case of abduction. I just published 2,000 pages of handbook on abductive cognition, and there are two parts that are totally related to logic and not necessarily directly, I repeat, to scientific reasoning, but certainly concerned to scientific reasoning and to promote further knowledge about scientific reasoning.
Thank you, Lorenzo. It seems that we also lost ATOCHA again.
Oh boy.
But there is a person named ATOCHA Aliseda that just arrived, so we don't know whether is she the one that we are waiting for. But let's wait for Gabrielle to allow that ATOCHA to open her mic. Meanwhile, I want to ask you more individual questions. First, I have one for yes, it's ATOCHA, but we still need Gabrielle to help us. So meanwhile, I have a question for Otavio and Bryson. So let's make it, but then first is going to be for Bryson and then for Otavio. So some philosophers have highlighted the importance of material reasoning in understanding descriptive languages. This is very close to what Bryson was replying to the first question. And so I wonder whether can alternative approaches to consequence relations provide a broader perspective on the role of descriptive language, which language you have in mind, in scientific reasoning, and can they change or enrich traditional accounts of what scientific reasoning is, also about what applicability of logic in science can be. So Bryson, please, can you unmute yourself?
There I am. Okay. That's a big ask as far as the question and its scope goes. When I think about logic and how we use it in the sciences, it's a matter of patterns of reasoning, and somehow or other we manage to arrive at patterns of reasoning that we can actually, what should I say, describe in formal terms, in the sense that learning to use the symbols according to basic rules leads us to certain conclusions in a reliable way. When we think about scientific reasoning, we can think even about mathematical reasoning here, and imagine, for instance, trying to reason with a system of numerals like the Roman system of numerals. And what we end up with is a system of numerals that actually works in its way. It has some limitations, but to calculate in it or to reason in it becomes almost impossible when you actually have to do, I don't know, I think of people who actually had to do economic transactions on a large scale in the Roman Empire. And that would have been very, very difficult given the clumsiness of the system of representation that you have. And there, we don't even have a particular conflict. We just have bad symbols or bad systems of symbols that we can't reason effectively with. And the same goes to some extent for different approaches to express, say, quantum mechanics. There are nicer and not so nice ways of doing it, and taste sometimes comes in here too. But let's see. So I think that logic in general has proven itself to be a very useful tool in many contexts, and the developments of more recent symbolic logics as compared to, again, ancient methods and language for them have assisted us in building nice systematic ways of expressing consequence relations that can get quite rich, alongside, of course, the use of mathematics. One of the things here I wanted to say about scientific reasoning is that I think Wilfrid Seller's account of material reasoning is particularly important here, because it takes us beyond formal logics while capturing a very important category of reasoning that we participate in terms of recognizing, for instance, that things that are red through and through cannot be green at all. And of course, even those colors are questionable from a scientific perspective, but in natural language, that's a very clear inference. And it's interesting to see how that happens, because it requires the material reasoning or something like the material reasoning that Sellers advocated for.
Many thanks, Bryson. Otavio?
Yes, I actually agree fully with Bryson. And I think the way I would put this is, when Tarski introduced the notion of logical consequence in his 1936 paper, he formulated in a way that it was meant not to have any empirical content at all. And he tried to capture that by saying, look, we're going to vary all the range of and permute the objects in the domain of interpretation, except, of course, for the logical constants. And so it doesn't matter what it is that we are reasoning about, and we will have the validity as the result of those things that are preserved over the variations of the objects under the domain. And I think that it's actually a mistake. That was what suggests a logic is topic neutral, right? That, of course, it's an idea that you trace back all the way back to Aristotle when he first introduced, right? And but it turns out that doesn't quite work, because there are pieces of reasoning that are indeed dependent on specific objects that we are reasoning about. That's the way that Bryson presented it. That's the materiality of it, right? And as we know, we are all familiar, said, oh, yeah, we can accommodate that by adding extra premises, right? That's where the content is, and so on. But that's not quite right, because that gives us the false impression that we can reason about a certain domain independently of thinking about the objects that we are focusing on. And it does matter what these objects are, because some of those things are properties that would clash with some of the inferences that we want to make, right?
Mm-hmm.
Example I love to use is the issue of distributivity in quantum mechanics. In fact, that's how quantum logics were uncovered, right? There is an inconsistency between non-relativistic quantum mechanics with the spin principle, the Heisenberg uncertainty relations, and distributivity. These three things cannot hang on together. Something has to go. Of course, you can change quantum mechanics and keep distributivity, right? That's what basically the Bohmian interpretations did. Right? But if you want to hold on to non-relativistic quantum mechanics, well, then you have to change distributivity, and classical logic goes through the window, and quantum logics emerge. So that's an illustration of the materiality of the reasoning. So what you're reasoning about matters, right? And that's the role that material reasoning has played. Right? And as a result, I think, that challenges a certain received picture of the logic, right? That logic is topic neutral, independent of, as Starsky put it, right? It doesn't matter, right? There's no empirical constraints are part of logic. I think that's a mistake, right? Logic in that sense, it's part of our ways of asking questions about the world, our ways of inquiry, right? And there's no special role in that sense, right? And that's one of the things that we learn throughout the 20th century, right? Even logic is revisable exactly on these material grounds, right? And that change in an important and I think correct way, though the sort of received view about what logic is, makes it also more interestingly, more empirical, right? And which, of course, empiricists are delighted to highlight.
Well, before moving to Lorenzo and ATOCHA's individual questions, I want to make a follow-up on this one. You had already mentioned some ideas about this, Otavio, but I want to hear Bryson and maybe yourself a bit more on what is the difference between having material content involved in analyzing reasoning and in saying something about logic. Because somebody can say, yes, reasoning is material dependent, right? You are reasoning about things, but that doesn't necessarily impact our conception of logic. So if any of you have any answer to this, I'll be very happy. Thank you.
Well, I think if we want to have a logic that will cope with the kinds of consequences and situations and conflicts that we actually encounter in thinking about the world, we really do need to cope with inconsistency. It's not just, of course, a tension between quantum mechanics or issues or concerns about the nature of quantum mechanics, but it's also the conflict between that and understanding of space-time itself, which is a completely different language, really. And when you think of it that way, we have a motivation there, perhaps, to find a way to smooth that water and bring these things together in one story. I think there's still a kind of underlying motivation there to tell one story that has this kind of smooth structure that doesn't require sort of shifts in how you apply concepts from one application to another. That's a kind of an idealistic goal, but along the way, if we want to tell a story about this world, it seems that we need to tell a richer story. We need some, perhaps 2 languages, perhaps more. And over time, we may be able to reconcile and sort of understand better what leads to these kinds of tensions and the differences in particular between, for instance, GTR and quantum mechanics. They don't fit together. GTR is clearly a classical theory. But that we have this, I suppose, perhaps a reasonable dream of reconciling them, putting them together into a nice, coherent package. But at the same time, I think we can only get there by working with the theories we have now, which we know already are quite effective, quite reliable in many contexts. So, that there are these boundaries and there are these tensions, which would be nice to smooth out. But the way to it is certainly not to demand consistency today.
Okay, and again, I'm very sympathetic with Bryson's comments, and I think Maria, you press an important issue in your question, because I do think the idea of material reasoning, right, can be interpreted in different ways. So the way I'm interpreting it is, well, if you have any content in your reasoning, right, it's not just the form, but it's about something, well, then it becomes material, right? It matters what it is you're reasoning about, right? Now, as I mentioned, the way that Tarski set up the notion of logical consequence, he was trying to separate these 2 things. Logic is formal. That's one of the requirements. It's not empirical, so there is no such a thing as material reasoning as part of logic, right? For him, this is just the application of logic, right? You have logic offering the formal framework, the formally valid arguments, then you interpret them by adding premises and however you're going to interpret in the language. And for him, it was very important not to confuse these 2 things, right? And in large part, I think that's an inheritance from Frege, that for the same reasoning, Frege also thought that it was important that logic be formal in just this sense. Frege was very concerned with issues. He thought that formality in part will guarantee the validity of the inference irrespectively of the content, right? And it turns out that I think that way of framing it is very misleading, right? Because it suggests that we can have a logic independently of any possible interpretations. And I don't think that that's right, even of classical logic, right? Because the very idea of formality, right, of logical form of an argument requires an interpretation, right? So what is the form of modus ponens? We say, well, anything of the form if A then B, A therefore B, right? And say, well, how about can A, for example, can B have a logic, can A, for example, have a logical structure? Can it be itself a conditional, right? And if you do that and you allow it, then you invalidate modus ponens, right? That's a beautiful example that McGee came with counterexample for modus ponens with embedded conditionals. So then the question is, okay, what is the form of modus ponens, right? Now, the answer to the question requires an interpretation. So the very idea that formality is something that it stands on its own, independently of content, independent of materiality, I don't think that works, right? So we need then, in recognizing this, I think we are then able to have a richer picture of logic, where formality and content cannot be so neatly separated as the traditional picture will have. And I think that makes logic more interesting, right? Makes it closer to our ways of investigating that we are all familiar with.
Great, great, Otavio. Yep. Now we are going to move to Lorenzo and ATOCHA's question, but I think it's going to be connected to the materiality of scientific reasoning, because for the work has been focused mostly on emphasizing not only the formal aspects of scientific reasoning, but also the cognitive side and the epistemic elements that take place in science and that should be reflected in our philosophical and formal analysis of whatever scientific reasoning is. So I was wondering, how can logic interact with other disciplines such as epistemology, cognitive science, now artificial intelligence, or general sides of philosophy of science to enhance our understanding of scientific reasoning and scientific inferential practices? So, ATOCHA, it's great to have you back. Can you open your camera? Can you speak?
Sure. My camera, I don't know how to open my camera, but I think it's safer if I keep it off. Okay. Just in case I go back again. Okay. So this question that you made to Lorenzo and myself, it's very much connected to the previous question, in my opinion, when you asked, could you share an example where a specific logical framework has significantly advanced our understanding of scientific reasoning? My answer to that question was no. No, in terms of logic. Why? My example, and this links to the question you have now, how logic interacts with other disciplines. And this is with the characterization of scientific reasoning as problem solving. I think a wonderful example of how different areas, disciplines can interact, in this case, in the service of scientific discovery, is a work that Herbert Simon, Pat Langley, and other people offered us in their book, Scientific Discovery, Computational Explorations of the Creative Processes. This is, in my opinion, a wonderful example where the history of science and a logical computational framework can interact. First of all, think of a particular scientific discovery. Let me just read it out, 2 lines. In 1618, Johannes Kepler discovered his third law of planetary motion. The cube of a planet's distance from the sun is proportional to the square of its period. And well, then the author goes on how to represent this law. And they devise a computer program in which basically they reconstruct the discovery. How to do it? First of all, you have to go into the history of science, in particular of this discovery, and have your own interpretation or reconstruction on how was it done. And then you need to implement it on a computer program. And their program basically had several processes. One of them has to do with representation, how to represent the data, and how to gather the data, and then how to generalize this data. Basically, this is a very, very basic program in which we can see more in general how the discovery of regularities or of laws is performed. So I would say that this showed us not only how a logical computational framework can be used for a scientific discovery, but how is that we can have a pluralistic view of scientific methodology in which logic, history, and perhaps cognitive aspects, and this is more of what Lorenzo has worked, can interact. But we need in this case, a logical, systematic way of reconstructing scientific discovery. Nowadays, and I will finish by this small comment, nowadays we can still talk about reconstruction of scientific discoveries, but our tools, our frameworks have gone beyond. Now they help us to discover new regularities or new, perhaps scientific issues, not scientific concepts though, because we have the limitation of language. And this is, I think, one of the greatest things, but also limitations. Logic cannot go beyond its own language. And that's why you cannot discover new concepts through any logical framework that we can think of. Thank you.
Thanks, ATOCHA. Now, Lorenzo, do you want to say that ATOCHA is wrong? Do you want to support ATOCHA's?
I agree with ATOCHA, of course, but I can add that you said that this is the individual concerns. So I agreed with John Wood's idea of a naturalization of logic. So what is the meaning of naturalization of logic? Is to relax some of the requirements of classical logic. Before I said that is the king of logic. In Italian, logic is female, so it is the queen of the queen of logic, classical logic. So naturalization of logic means that, for instance, you have to ask logic to be more related empirically to real ways of human reasoning, okay? Every kind of human reasoning. And the good making ties between premises and conclusion, the various ways of making ties before from premise and conclusion. So that data-rich, the classical deduction repels the information, so to say, but another kind of logic that is more related to the quantity of information, for instance, in a non-monotonic way, is something important. Because in science, it is important also to reason on this of a lot of information. And, of course, beyond the naturalization of logic means to go beyond classical deductive validity and classical truth preservation. So if an example I can give you is related to Aristotle. So Aristotle invented the classical logic that was called the syllogistic logic. When I had the opportunity to read the prior analytics in which Aristotle explains induction, but also abduction, that is in Greek epagoge and apagoge. It was really interesting to see the aspects related to the status of abduction were discovered by Aristotle thanks to the theory of syllogism. And for instance, Aristotle was very clear in saying that in the case of abductive reasoning, you have to be open to something different in between premises and conclusion. So you do not have to fear the use of something external. And this is absolutely interesting because is and was related, even if this kind of research about this kind of reasoning was not followed, because, you know, there was the triumph of the syllogistic reasoning and some classical logic, and the triumph of the concept of induction. It was very interesting because it was related to a kind of naturalization of logic in which the situatedness of reasoning is important. And, of course, emphasizing the situatedness of reasoning is important, for instance, in scientific discovery, because if you are making scientific research in an environment that from the epistemological, informational, and cognitive point of view, here cognitive science is important, that is not good from the point of view of your situatedness, this is not good from scientific discovery. So in this sense, coming back, so in this case, I did not have to use recent research in logic, but coming back to the source of logic was interesting to emphasize, thanks to Aristotle, situatedness of reasoning. That is less important in classical logic, of course. And this is an example of the fact that, in my opinion, Aristotle was able to detect this kind of aspects thanks to the fact that he was able to invent the syllogistic logic. That is the classical framework. This is my individual concern.
What interesting
related to Aristotle.
What an interesting view ATOCHA's and LORENZO's were. I hope that our audience have some more questions about the methodology of how to naturalize or put some content in the study of reasoning with using other areas. I hope somebody picks this type of question up. But then let's move to the closing reflections, and I'm going to ask you to summarize the importance of logic for understanding scientific reasoning in 1 or 2 sentences, and then we move to the Q&A. Can we start with you, Lorenzo?
Okay. So thanks to logic, you can have definitely clear ideas, clear limits, clear definitions of concepts. And so this is extremely important because it is against the obscurities, against ambiguities, and so it is a teaching also. From the didactic point of view, from the point of view of the correct reasoning. In this case, I use the word correct reasoning, not necessarily in the sense of correctness as it is in logic, okay? But, clear reasoning, clear concepts, and so this is important. In my opinion, it is a kind of summary of my idea of logic.
Thanks, Lorenzo. ATOCHA, do you want to have a closing remark?
Sure. You said 1 or 2 sentences. I wrote something. So here it is. Logic as a tool for reasoning is essential for scientific reasoning, especially when the inferential aspect is taken into account. That is, when we aim at understanding what follows from what in a scientific context, such as in scientific discovery. That's it.
Thank you, ATOCHA. Otavio?
So I would say that the central role of logic in the context of science is to highlight possibilities, what can or cannot be inferred in a given context. And of course, when you highlight possibilities, you also highlight impossibilities, right? And that opens up what can or cannot be done given a logical framework, allowing for additional ones to come in.
Perfect. And finally, Bryson, closing remarks, please.
Muting again. I think of Wilfrid Sellers' work as a very important part of my sort of picture of how these things work. And one of the principles that he drew on and made a fair bit of fuss about was the idea of there being real implications that are not logical. Material reasoning is the phrase that he used sometimes. And to me, that's a more important thing than the things we do with logic, largely because, well, with logic, we're typically working in an abstract attempt to get reasoning boiled down to some basic principles that nobody's going to object to. Which turns out to be a difficult project, but especially with people like Graham Priest coming into the game. But I think in scientific reasoning, we do two different kinds of things. We on the one hand do recognize mathematics, which I think of as largely stipulative, often with useful applications, but still stipulative. And on the other hand, when we talk about material contexts where we're actually describing the world, we need predicates that we can actually connect in various ways. And that's something we see in natural language, where we recognize that one color, say red, is incompatible with being red, that is to say, is incompatible with being green. And that's a Salarzian point about what he called natural reasoning, in a sense, I suppose. I don't think I have the right word there, but the point being that vocabulary that we don't typically think of as logical vocabulary today carries a lot of weight in reasoning that can be sort of placed or moved to some extent using formal logics to sort of impose a connection there. But I think that's sort of putting the cart before the horse when we think about what's really happening here. We're talking about, for instance, just the basic point that things that are red, at least for human beings using natural languages, are not green. And other such kinds of reasoning are essential, certainly in the sciences, because that's the sort of structure that we try to build in order to manage to describe and consider and reason about the descriptions we're giving of various things in the world. And we've got an enterprise in science which has put a lot of effort into handing good reasoning tools to us that we can use in practical applications in the world and in sort of broad scientific thinking about, or even just speculative thinking about various things that might happen under other conditions that we don't yet actually encounter. So I think that the use of formalism is helpful in a way that allows us to build clearer models. The people ask the question, why is mathematics so important in science? And I think the right answer is, well, it provides us with a great sort of a great number. I was thinking really of a menu, a massive menu of various kinds of inferential structures that we can build and that we can then and often do connect to the world, whether it's just counting things or it's performing calculations in quantum mechanics.
Many thanks, Bryson. That was a long sentence for sure, but it neatly connects. We are going to take it as if you had replied to the first question in the Q&A section, which was presented by Fabián Benachi Maldonado and was for you and Otavio. So from now on, people, if you have questions, people in the Zoom meeting, you can raise your hand in reactions and then you raise your hand. And Yes, Atocha, I see you, but let me read this question to Otavio. If logical inference depends on how we interpret concepts, can we really make a distinction between material inferences and logical ones? Bryson has already mentioned some of the ways in which we can do it. So, Otavio, what about your view?
Yeah, well, we can in the sense that each logic will identify certain classes of inferences as being valid, right? And it will spell out, according to the semantics and the standards of validity of that logic, why that's the case, right? So the question is whether those things are indeed valid. And that's exactly what often non-classical logics will press. Right? And you say, well, you think that's valid, but how about this? Right? And offer as a counterexample that will challenge that validity. And of course, at that point, there will be a debate about whether those are proper, as I mentioned in the case of modus ponens, what is the proper form of the rule and what actually validates or invalidates it, right? And but I don't think, and the fact that we may not have a sharp distinction between formal and material doesn't mean that there is no distinction, right? So there are clear cases of things given a setup, given an assumptions, those are the valid inferences, right? And then you may challenge those assumptions, say, well, wait, how about this, right? So, and I think that's how the debate has been moving on.
Great, thank you, Otavio. Atocha, you had a question.
1 second. I am sorry to jump into not a question, really, but I really wanted to read something. A comment from one of the pieces I had no chance. 20 years ago, I wrote a paper called Logics in Scientific Discovery, and one of my conclusions was this, and I really want to say it and then ask my colleagues, not so much if they agree, but to what extent we can take seriously pluralism for scientific methodology. Let me call it this. So what I wrote was logic, classical or otherwise, in philosophy of science nowadays, to put it simply, is out of fashion. In fact, although classical logic is still part of the curricula in philosophy of science graduate programs, and this is still the case for programs that deserve to be called as such, students soon learn that a whole generation of philosophers regarded logical positivism as a failed attempt, not just for the logic though, claiming that scientific practice does not follow logical patterns of reasoning, many of which favor studies of science based on historical cases. So, why bother about the place of logic in scientific research? On the one hand, the present situation in logical research has gone far beyond the formal developments that deductive logics reached last century, and new research includes the formalization of several other types of reasoning, induction and at least like induction and abduction. And here is the question I have for the following statement. On the other hand, we claim for a balanced philosophy of science, which now it's another way is to call it pluralistic, one in which both methods, the formal and the historical, and perhaps many others, may be complementary, together providing a pluralistic view of science in which no method is the predominant one. Thank you, Maria, for allowing me to say this.
Let me ask first, Lorenzo, what do you think about what Atocha just read?
So about the problem of logic of scientific discovery, I agree with Atocha. I always agreed with Atocha perspective of these things. And so I do not have anything to add. Of course, As I already said, I want to emphasize the need for logic and for logicians to maximize their interaction with other researchers, okay? For instance, in philosophy of science and in cognitive science. So not to be in a kind of closed region, okay? But in a more interactive region. In this case, it is also necessary to produce logical systems that can be grasped in a better way, or at least known in a good way by the other researchers of the other fields, okay? And given the fact we are dealing with the importance of logic as a way of knowing something more about scientific reasoning, it is necessarily, I think, it is just an advice, my personal advice for logicians to be intertwined with other field of research, because there is also the other effect that from other fields of research, philosophy, mathematics, cognitive science, and many other empirical research, logicians can get some new ideas for possible new perspectives and new logical frameworks.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Bryson, do you want to comment on this?
When I think about the place of logic in the practice of science, I think of the kinds of meanings and predicates that actually appear in the sciences when we think about Seller's concept of material reasoning. And it's something, of course, we also have in natural languages. And it's interesting to me that while these are clearly, in many cases, just not formal kinds of reasoning, you can't sort of distinguish, on the one hand, the fact that something that's red all over can't be green from something that isn't red can't be red. The second, of course, sounds like a logical point. The first sounds kind of mysterious, but it's just as real a relation or a constraint on what's possible, at least in the natural languages we use to describe our world. I'm again turning to the material reasoning that Sellers talks about, where we don't have simple systems of words that do all of the reasoning work. We actually depend on reasoning that is connected to the entire vocabulary that we use to describe things. And I think recognizing that kind of, it diminishes the gap that people see between mathematics and its stand as being correct, and the natural sciences and even our descriptions in natural languages, because there really are inference rules that are part and parcel of those languages.
Thank you, Bryson. Otavio?
Well, so what would you like me to do? Because now there are different trends going on.
Well, to try to respond to ATOCHA's question of whether there is still a discussion about pluralism and the type of logical frameworks that we use to reconstruct, to build up whatever we consider to be scientific reasoning, or the reasoning that takes place in the sciences, right?
Okay. Yeah. No, of course, I do think pluralism is required to make sense of the variety of different kinds of reasoning that we find in the sciences, right? And so, as I said earlier, also I think it's very difficult to pinpoint what is the underlying logic, right? And exactly because given any finite pieces of reasoning, there are a plurality of logics that will validate these pieces of reasoning and will validate others, right? And then so it's very, very difficult to say, okay, this is the logic. So you do need, I think, a plurality as in the end. Even if, as I also said earlier, that I think we start with classical logic, right? Lorenzo said it's the mother of all logics, right? That's something that also Newton da Costa always said. And I think there's something right about that. And because of all the good features that he has. But he has also the limitations. So now one thing that I think we need also to bear in mind is, strictly speaking, except for computer science, logic is not really applied anywhere in the sciences, right? It's just informal logic, not the formal part, right? So it's even in mathematics, we have rigorous but informal pieces of reasoning, and that means there is a lot of material inferences that is ingrained in mathematical reasoning, right? It's not purely formal. It's relying on what is it that you're talking about. If you're talking about topological spaces, is one thing. If you're talking about differential equations, it may be another, right? And you rely on sometimes geometrical properties of the object, sometimes properties of the underlying framework, and those are not neatly and easily tracked, without in a purely logical setting. And so those are challenges, I think, right?
Thank you, Otavio. Thank you, ATOCHA, for the question. We have now Julio Perez, sorry. Julio, can you hear us? Can you open your mic, please?
Hello?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you. You can also open your camera if you wish.
Okay.
Everyone can
I'm here.
do that
Hello.
now, just so you know.
Hello. Well, first of all, my name is Julio Perez. I am gastrointestinal surgeon, and I am active researcher too. And I'm a top fan of all of you. Well, I see this, the theory of science, like the construction of a building. Yes, there is the brick layers, the engineers, the architects, and the investors. Okay, well, I think that the doctors and the people that make science are like the bricklayers. Okay, and you are like the investors or the architects of the building. So I am going to say this since the perspective of someone who is working in making science. I feel that there is a huge gap between the theoric logic of science and a practical application. And I would like to know if you know or if you in your institutions there is any program that allows to the people that make science day to day to apply all this theory of science in our daily basis practice. Because I see the example of the ontic logic, that the ontic logic has a very practical application, but the people that applies, the lawyers doesn't apply the ontic logic in their daily basis. The judges, those are who applies all the theory of the ontic logic. But in medicine and in biomedical investigation, biomedical research, no one applies in our daily basis logic of science. So I would like to know if you know any program in your institution for people like us, for we can apply all this theory. Thank you.
Thank you, Julio. Atocha, do you want to go first?
Sure, Julio. Well, unfortunately, maybe I don't know of one, but there is no program for what you are looking for. However, even in your area, there is you have the term clinical reasoning. So medical doctors not just talk about clinical reasoning, but you learn to perform clinical reasoning. There are several books, as you of course may know, which use logic, but not formal logic. They use statistics, they use some other reflections, which may be labeled under reasoning, but not so much under logic. So I think you are looking for a tailored, so to speak, application. And this would be more of a matter of a project rather than a educational program. I am, as you know, as well interested in performing that. So we can talk about that later, as let me make this public. You already wrote to me individually in the chat. So maybe my colleagues can give us some advice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do anybody else have an answer to that question? A sad answer, Otavio?
Well, I'm not sure I have an answer. Because I don't think there are institutionalized programs, Julio, for what you're looking for, in large part because, as you know, as a practitioner, the explicit attention to logic is not what shapes the research, right? And you just use informally whatever kinds of reasoning that you do, right? And of course, with movements in evidence-based medicine and things of that sort, there is an attempt to systematize, at least with some notion of evidence that would organize the research in a certain way, and then attention to the kinds of statistical patterns, right? Especially when you're doing randomized clinical trials, or when you're doing meta-analysis over a variety of studies, right? But those are, in a way, applications of probability and statistics more than logic, right? And so, and as ATOCHA said, there are books that try to apply issues of logic in medicine, right? So there has a complex, long manuscript on that, right? But what you're looking for is something that shapes the practice, right? That I'm not aware of, I'm afraid. Maybe you can start with. Yeah.
Well, yeah, he's very committed to that project. Thank you very much, Julio, and thank you, Atocha and Otavio. Now let's move to Alejandro's question, and then we have another question from YouTube. Alejandro?
Thanks. My question is for Lorenzo and Otavio. I have this in mind. What should be the methodological precautions that philosophers should keep in mind in short of applying logic to reconstruct scientific reasoning adequately, particularly thinking about how to avoid philosophical biases?
So, Lorenzo or Otavio, who wants to go first? Otavio, I guess you want to go first.
Well, Lorenzo, if you want to start, it's okay with me, but you're muted. You're muted, Lorenzo.
Yeah, now we can hear.
Oh, sorry. Can you repeat the last part of the question, because it was not clear to me?
Okay. what should be the methodological precautions that philosophers keep in mind when we apply logic to reconstruct scientific reasoning? In short of, or in particular, thinking about how to avoid philosophical biases or philosophical errors.
Okay, so as I said before, if I correctly understood your question, the use of logic is always a tool that can be exploited to avoid philosophical errors on the mistakes, fallacies, and so. So from this point of view, the use of logic, of using logic as a help to build a better perspective on scientific reasoning is always welcome and good, okay? Even if logic, we said before, has limitations, so we cannot get from logic a complete picture of scientific reasoning. But surely we can increase our knowledge about scientific reasoning, and not only in an abstract way, but also from a, so to say, a material point of view. Because when earlier I said that situatedness is important in science, for instance, in biomedical science, that was quoted just a moment ago. This is a result that you can get from logic. And I quoted Aristotle, but not only, but it is something that is related to the organization of science in our current era, because there are some aspects of the organization of science that, at least in my opinion, jeopardize what I called in a recent book discoverability. Okay, so if you jeopardize discoverability, you jeopardize science. So there is a collection of problems, and also these problems are important, at least in our era. Science, the challenge to jeopardize science is not philosophy or an error of philosophy that has to be amended by logic, but it is the material, economical, and political organization of some scientific institutions. For instance, and especially in biomedical settings.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Ottavio, please.
Well, Alejandro, you raise a really interesting question. Of course, it depends on what you mean by a philosophical bias, because in many cases of applications of logic, it was what we can call the bias that motivated the application in the first place, right? So, for example, when constructive logics or intuitionistic logics were being developed, what prompted them to do that was what they perceived as shortcomings of the mathematical reasoning that was prevalent at the time and still today, right? Non-constructive ones. You show, look, from the sheer fact that we get a contradiction by assuming that the non-existence of something is enough to show that that something exists, even though we had no idea what that something looks like, what properties it has, or how to actually construct it. And intuitionists were very concerned about that. Say, look, unless you're able to construct the relevant mathematical object, how can we say that the object exists, right? Just from the fact that there is a contradiction, if you assume that it doesn't, is not enough. You may say, look, isn't that a philosophical bias, right? It was by assuming the need for that kinds of constructions as a requirement in mathematical reasoning that led to the development of intuitionistic logics, right? So it really depends on what what you consider as the bias, right? So another source, and that's something that I will point you to a very interesting paper that Maria is working on. When you think about applications of logic in case studies in philosophy of science, right? What kinds of historiographic assumptions may be built into when you try to reconstruct formally a certain scientific episode, right? And how that may tip in one way or another the way in which the reconstruction goes. And she explores a variety of different cases to illustrate ways in which, in that case, historiographical, conceptions can taint the particular logical reconstructions at hand, right? So maybe that would be another way in which you can think about philosophical bias, right? So that it really depends, right? Well, what we take the bias to be. In some cases, maybe they are beneficial, maybe they are required for certain applications of logic. In other cases, maybe they can be misleading. It really depends.
Okay, thank you, Ottavio. I will take Alejandro's question and extend it to Bryson, because Bryson has mentioned in many of the papers that he has written, especially about chunk and permeate, that philosophers tend to have this philosophical bias of choosing a logic and then trying to model or reconstruct pieces of scientific reasoning to support that particular logical framework. So, Bryson, do you have any suggestions, methodological suggestions on what to pay attention to when applying logic to reconstruct scientific reasoning?
There's a lot of difficult ground in that context. I find, if you look at the history of cases where conflicts have arisen in the sciences, where we really can't reconcile, for instance, calculations of the age of the Earth from the point of view of geologists and from the point of view of late 19th century physicists. There was a huge tension there because the physicists couldn't build models that allowed either for convection in the Earth, or didn't build models, I should say, that allowed for convection in the Earth, which would have been enough, or for other ways of creating further heat. There were measurements at that point of the increase of heat as you work your way into the Earth. And Kelvin actually just modeled a solid Earth on that basis and looked at the transfer, the motion of heat through such materials, and came up with a very low age for the age of the Earth. And of course, the geologists said, "What? How could that be? We've looked at a lot of features, and we see really clear evidence of a much larger age overall when it comes to mountain ranges and erosion and so on and so forth." So I think in these contexts, there can't be a real tension between, say, one science and another, Kelvin and the geologists in particular here, and that's something that I think philosophers have to pay attention to, because you need to look at the room that persists for correcting or resolving such conflicts. And we do it, reasonably effectively, but often it takes quite a long time. While the solution was sometimes announced in respect of discovery of radioactive decay and the amount of heat released, then it turns out that convection alone in the mantle will do the job of sort of eliminating the worries about the Earth's age and its reconciliation with the geological evidence that we have. I don't know how helpful that would be,
but at least, now we are aware of another problem that we have to deal with. Now let's move to two questions that we have on YouTube. So the first one is also by Fabian Bernache Maldonado, and he is asking, I guess it's related to Lorenzo calling classical logic the queen of logic. So it says, is the classical interpretation of logical concepts special in some way? And if so, which way it is? The floor is open for any of you to want to respond, but I guess we need to hear something from Lorenzo.
So about the fact that I call the classical logic the queen of logic. So I am convinced that the classical logic is the queen of logic, because without classical logic, we are not able to distinguish almost anything in human reasoning. Because when you establish the syllogistic logic, that is the capacity to start from premises, to arrive to the conclusion without anything more in the middle, but just a rule, this is extremely important because it is the birth of the queen of logic, okay, and the possibility of all the other perspectives. So in this sense, logic is the queen of logic, and it is extremely important because it is the basis, and this is obvious also from the historical point of view. So you can imagine very easily what happened before Aristotle, okay? There were people that were able to perform classical logic de facto, that is mathematicians, geometricians, because geometricians, of the ancient geometricians and the mathematicians, were interested in starting from true premises and to arrive to true conclusions, okay? This is de facto something that refers to classical logic. But the merit of Aristotle is to build the abstract system that describes this kind of behavior, okay? Philosophers are not compelled to start from true premises and to arrive to true conclusions, that is, to make theorems. But this was the problem of mathematicians. So this is extremely important, in my opinion, because you can see a lot of things in the light and in the perspective of classical logic.
Thank you,
Ottavio?
Lorenzo. Thank you. Ottavio or Bryson, do you want to say anything about how to interpret logical concepts? Yeah.
Yeah, so let me, Fabian, this is an interesting question. Of course, there is one factual answer, right? So, for example, and this comes from characterization principles, right? And so classical logic is the only logic, right, in which Levenheim-Skolem theorem, compactness theorem, and the completeness theorem hold, right? So there are some very special features that it has that makes it special in and of itself, right? So of course, those are metalogical features, right? But they trickle down in terms of inferential resources that the logic provides. And it's not surprising that it has, being widely used, exactly in large part because of those features that it has. But those features also comes with their limitations, right? So because the compactness and the Levenheim-Skolem theorem holds, there are non-standard models when you're dealing with domains that have infinitely many objects. Now, that might be interesting, and it was explored, with non-standard models in analysis, and for example, but also can be very complicated because it violates some features of mathematical practice, right? So, for example, if you're studying analysis, mathematical analysis, one of the results that proves that books in analysis will make students prove is the categoricity of the real numbers, right? That any two models of real analysis are isomorphic. Now, that result only holds in second-order logic, right? Because the categoricity cannot be obtained in first order. So you need to actually shift to second-order logic to be able to do that, not first-order classical logic, right? Of course, second order logic is still classical logic in a broader sense, but it doesn't have the completeness result anymore, right? And so then you have some interesting things. So it allows you to express more because you can now quantify over relations and properties, which you cannot in first order logic. You only quantify over objects. So, but because you can quantify over more things, you can state things that turn out to be logically true by these additional resources that we cannot prove, syntactically, and then it becomes incomplete. In fact, that the incompleteness of second order logic is a result from Gödel's theorems. So there are interesting features, that the classical interpretations do have, and it's not by chance that they have so widespread. But let me close just by making a counterfactual speculation, right? Classical logic was defined, in the hands of Frege, right? At least the mathematical logic was thinking about a certain class of object, right? Arithmetics. And so objects that are fairly stable, no vagueness, no indeterminacy, and so on. What would have happened if what prompted the attempt to formalize logic was done not by prioritizing mathematics as the model to start thinking about logic, but something very different, right? Things that are more inconsistent, they're fluid, unstable, indeterminate, vague. We could actually call what we call classical logic now something very different, right? But probably we end up with having something that it's non-classical as the standard logic. And you had a very different story about what classical logic would look like in this counterfactual setting. All right.
Thank you, Ottavio. There is another question for BRYSON about Sellars' work. So Andres Bovenriet wanted to know what were your suggestions on what to read on Sellars about material inference. So if you could make 3 suggestions, BRYSON, what would they be?
Suggestions with material reasoning, right, is contrasted, of course, with formal reasoning. And we certainly know in natural languages and in scientific languages, we don't depend strictly on formal relations. In the sciences, we can often come up with a mathematical equation that will tell us how to reason about some particular, set of facts or observations. But again, that's not it. How do I want to put this? That's a substantive sort of claim about the world that you're making when you adopt those kinds of rules. But at the same time, they are, very reliable rules in many contexts. Even, if we're dealing with a theory that has sort of faded in terms of its place, classical mechanics is no longer considered to be true, but it's still an extremely useful tool for reasoning in many contexts. We don't have to mess very much with quantum mechanics to deal with the orbit of the moon. We don't need to deal with GTR either, general relativity. So I think one of the things that we're dealing with here for Sellars is that we recognize inference much more widely and much more richly than we do in formal logics. And that's Sellars' concept of material reasoning, which is really what undergirds the use of certain predicates in the sciences.
But BRYSON, I think the question was about 3 references from Sellars.
3 references? Sorry.
So I think Andres was interested in reading more about Sellars on material reasoning. Well, what would you recommend him to read? What would you recommend all of us to read?
I'd actually have to go to the sources to give you those kinds of that kind of information off the top of my head would be risky. But I will, if you like, be happy
I'll
to.
write to you in copy with Andres, and then you can make all suggestions you want, maybe
Okay.
70 or 80 suggestions.
So in that case, copy me too, because I'll be interested in the answer.
Good, great.
And ATOCHA as
And
well.
for the audience that are watching us in YouTube, whenever Bryson give us that suggestions, I'm going to put it in the description of the video. So we have another question. This from Angel. This is from YouTube, and it is related to the one that Julio was raising about the applicability of logic in particular scientific disciplines. Angel is asking whether the same happens in other contexts where we don't see logic actually take place, but we have something like informal reasoning, and then we reconstruct it as being logical. And his case in mind is where we use deontic logic. Is there a context maybe in law, maybe in other types of practices where we have deontic operators in play, and whether the logic that is being used, particularly deontic logic, is only auxiliary, is not playing any role at all, or is organically involved but not maybe that explicit. So anybody that wants to answer to this question, I'll be happy to hear your response.
I think that's an interesting question there, because in large part, some of the motivations for deontic logic was to make sense of sort of their ethical dilemmas, right? Can we make sense of what their possibility, how they can even be formulated and formalized? And so usually, of course, I want to say that we don't need to have the explicitly, it's obligatory or it's permissible in the language for you to say, well, then we can use the deontic logic operators. Because sometimes there is an implicit invocation of those operators, right? When you have of course, some cases you say, well, we should do this or that, right? And if you understand this should as being normative and ethically constrained, then of course, then you have them. But in many cases, maybe you don't have the explicitly normative language, but it's implicitly adopted. And that might be enough for you to say, well, clearly there is an invocation of something that is taken to be obligatory here and will be appropriately formalized with the logic, right? So I think there are nuances. And that's part and parcel of the difficulty of applying the logic, right? Because it's not that the natural languages is much more fluid and informal. So whenever you're applying the logic, you are sort of regimenting and rigidifying things in a way that sometimes might be artificial. Right, and that goes back to the initial question about potential philosophical bias, right? We may squeeze things in by interpreting in a certain way a context that is done informally.
Thank you, Otavio. And I want to extend this question to ATOCHA, maybe not about deontic logic, but abduction and abductive reasoning, because maybe the scenario is different if we are talking about these types of reasoning that are not valid, that are not necessarily correct in the strong sense. We are not transmitting truth in those cases. But so is logic there explicit? Is it organically involved on how we reason in general context, particularly when using scientific elements? Or is it something that is auxiliary in some cases, or it doesn't play any role for this actual scientist in an explicit way? So, ATOCHA?
Sure. Well,
sorry, just for a moment. I'm afraid I have to go. I have an appointment at noon here, and I'm running out of time. Very sorry.
Thank you, Bryson. Yes. Thank you for being here. And
thanks for having me. Much appreciated.
Thank you. And thank you for the references that you will send us.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I didn't wanted to answer this question only because I think the question asks for different or several contexts in which deontic logic may be used. But allow me to use your extension, Maria, just to say that okay, so we have to be very clear on what part of the scientific reasoning we want to use. Is that we aim at modeling the phenomenon. First of all, it's impossible to use logic or any other tool to represent the whole process of scientific reasoning. I want to remind what Lorenzo said at the beginning. Scientific reasoning is dynamic. This means information changes. So we need to start with, we need a way of representing those information changes. That's why I think it's really difficult to talk about a specific logic. On the other hand, modal logic in general and deontic logic in particular may be used, of course, in contexts such as legal reasoning, in which we want to talk about the necessary and the possible. And that's why I think deontic logic is important. Last thing, in my own experience in seeing medical doctors discuss clinical cases, the first thing to note is, even if we just focus on logical reasoning informally, the first thing you notice is that there are several reasoning types that are interacting. In particular, in the medical context, they use a lot analogical reasoning, meaning they compare the clinical case they are discussing with previous cases, and then they infer or reason to what extent this particular case is similar to that other case that was solved using this or that. So, in short, I think it's almost impossible to model a phenomenon such as clinical reasoning using a single logic. And that's why it's so difficult. Maybe a framework like adaptive logics, and this is what I used to model or rather reconstruct a clinical case. Adaptive logic is really nice because you can combine deductive and abductive steps. So this allowed me to model some part of medical reasoning. I'm not sure if that, well, my answer was not so concrete, but I hope that it helped to have some panorama of at least the way I see things.
Thank you, ATOCHA. We have a last question. I will read it to you. I will ask you also to be very brief, so we are running out of time. We have already spent half an hour more than what we expected, but this is always a pleasure to be discussing with you. So this is coming from Andres Bovenriet, and the question is, the widespread use of general computer programs, it's not a kind of support for the usefulness of a general formal logic? Can we interpret it like that? Maybe ATOCHA, do you want to go first?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Whether the success of general computer programs do not support or actually reinforce our idea that logical in general formal logical frameworks are really useful.
Okay, so let's see if I understood. Let me mention some historical point. The original idea of the founders of artificial intelligence was to design and implement what they call GPS, a general problem solver. they thought, well, why don't we do a program that solves whatever scientific problem, or let me put it this way, something that can follow a problem-solving strategy. And that was impossible. So in a way, I agree with you, Andres. By the way, it's so nice that you followed us today. But I'm not sure if I understood your question so precisely in order to say that because we've seen, let me put it in my words, that programs like GPS did not meet their purpose, then we can say that a logical framework cannot do that either. However, this is my last comment on that, I think that what we've seen in general in the area of artificial intelligence is that there is a great success when problems that are solved are very domain specific. So this is my comment.
Thank you, ATOCHA. And before asking either Lorenzo or Otavio to give a response, I'm going to enrich Andres's question with some of Julio's concerns. So Julio was asking about what happens with those inferences that are drawn by artificial intelligence. First, as Andres was asking, whether we say that that's evidence in support of the strength of formal apparatuses, and also, do we call those scientific reasonings? So either Otavio or Lorenzo, we would be very happy to hear your answer.
Well, as I said earlier, and Andres, hello, it's very good to see you. And so I do think that, as I mentioned, computer science is the main place where formal logic is applied nowadays, right? In fact, you cannot just run most programs unless you do have an underlying logic. It's in computer science departments that most logicians nowadays have find jobs, and not in philosophy departments or elsewhere. So that is a significant source of support for the application of logic. Of course, nowadays, the way that artificial intelligence is being done, with the attempts of modeling, not logical reasoning anymore, right? But neural networks and interconnected things, there is, I suspect, we end up with less of a role for logic in the way that things will get done. And I find that concerning, right? Especially if you think about ways in which things like ChatGPT are built, right? The heuristics, which are, inherently unreliable, right? So the fact that, with a frequency of 80%, the next word in the sequences of queries is this, you have absolutely no connection with truth or reliability with that kind of heuristics, right? So in a way, it's a shame that, we will probably end up losing the significant role of logic there, and we're going to pay a big price as a result.
Thanks, Otavio. Is that scientific reasoning, what artificial intelligence is doing?
No, of course not.
Thank you. Lorenzo.
There's no reasoning there.
Lorenzo, you are muted.
Sorry, it was an automatic movement of my computer because I lost the network for a moment. So I think that in the classical AI, there was a lot of role played by logic because logic was needed, for instance, in many cases, for representing knowledge. They were called knowledge-based systems or expert systems. Now, with the current AI programs, statistics dominatis, so to say. Deep learning systems do not need logic, do not need practically anything, because they are able to process big data, a lot of data, and they are able to produce language results in natural language. And so in this case, I do not see a lot of logic present. But of course, in the Department of Computer Science, where people deal with intelligent AI scientists, a person that is trained in logic could be very helpful, because it will be, she will be able to understand tools and so on. But I have a course in this moment that is the name is Artificial Intelligence and Knowledge, in which I invited a lot of interdisciplinary people, and I have to say that the current AI is particularly empty from the philosophical, epistemological, and cognitive point of view, and powerful, by the way. No? Also, the ethicists have problems in imagining the way of dominating this kind of tools. There is also the phenomenon of ethics washing, you know. A lot of research in ethics, but that in reality, it is just unuseful, not applied, and so on. So in this case, logic plays a role in the origin of the concept of algorithm and of computer science, but in the current AI, I do not see a lot of logic present.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ottavio. Thank you, ATOCHA. And thank you, BRYSON, wherever you are. It was a great opportunity for LogicaMX to have you all here. With that, we have to conclude the session. But before, I want to make an announcement. Just let me share my screen if I can make something like that. We have already the 2025 calendar available on our website. You just click here and it's going to send you to where the calendars are. And here you are going to be able to click on it and download it. If you are a Spanish speaker, this is the one in English. And this year we are inspired by the topic of this roundtable. And we have Margaret Morrison, Hilary Putnam, Alexander Bird, Eleanor Knox, Carnap, and Newton da Costa as part of our current calendar. So with that said, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you to the audience that was present on YouTube, to the audience that was present on this Zoom meeting, and also to the audience that will be watching this in who knows how time. See you all, and thank you, Lorenzo, Ottavio, and ATOCHA once again.
So thank you
Thank
to
you.
Maria.
Great to see you. Happy New Year.
It was a pleasure to see also my optimal friend ATOCHA and Ottavio. Thanks to the audience.
Your friend of discovery.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Maria. It was a pleasure.
Ottavio,
also to
María,
the
gracias.
audience.
Andrés, qué gusto. Y Gabriel, muchas gracias también.
Bye, bye, bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Adiós.
Close the session now.
Ok.
Bye.
Voy a terminar la transmisión. Muchas gracias a las personas que sintonizaron. El video estará disponible, pues yo creo que en lo inmediato. Gracias.